Hello, W123 North America. This is a video primarily for Ken Wood trying to troubleshoot 4 inoperative or all inoperative windows. So kind of the flow of troubleshooting for power window issues. If it is a single window, clean the window switches first. If it is a diagonal pair, like driver's front, passenger rear, they are fused in diagonal pairs. So if you simultaneously lose a diagonal pair of windows, look to the fuses first. Always clean the fuses. It's a very good idea to just check and clean all the fuse contacts, or at least roll them back and forth in their contacts to make sure they're getting contact. But a single dead window, start at the switch. It's very easy to pop the switches apart and clean the contacts, and that does happen because they're an open switch and gunk can fall down in them over the years. Side note, the attractively priced aftermarket switches, on at least 2 or 3 occasions, I've seen them start malfunctioning in a matter of weeks. So clean your original switches. Don't buy the cheapos unless you absolutely have to. And even then, you can actually, I did this very recently for Sean Shook, a group member in Chicago. He had bought the cheaper window switches, and sure enough, one of them quit working pretty quickly. I took the nice fresh buttons and the actual metal contacts out of the new switches and put them in the old switch body, if you will, and cleaned the contacts, and that seems to be working just fine. I think it's actually the hard circuitry in those replacement switches that gives out too quickly. But at any rate, we're not going to go too much into depth with that. With this, we're primarily going after the power window relay, which is right behind the gauge cluster. It's not too much voodoo to pull the gauge cluster out. It just requires a little bit of finesse and patience, but also knowing how to approach it, which is the case with a lot of things, with a lot of cars. On a bunch of different makes and models, I need to take a door panel off to service a window regulator. And I can barely get the door panel back on because it's been busted up so badly by someone previous that didn't look up how to take it off before they tried to take it off. Like, I don't get rough with any door panel, any interior panel, anything on a given make and model before I look up how to take it apart, just because there really is no rhyme or reason to how a manufacturer will design, because sometimes it's literally like 2 screws and you pull up on a door panel. Other times it's all screws. You can't predict how a given door panel or a given gauge cluster will come off. It doesn't take very long to look up how it comes apart, and it can save you and anybody in the future a ton of headache, which is to the point of this video. To get to the window relay, first, I'm taking my trusty pocket knife, little slots, and with these little screw covers, they're kind of hard to find because they're very often broken. 2 little tabs that just clip in, and then I'll go across right there. That reveals 3 Phillips screws. Easy peasy. Now, there are 2 plastic, and a lot of times these are missing, but these 2 big gray plastic Phillips screws are just a 1/4 turn fastener. They don't really have threads on them, so you just turn it a 1/4 turn, it comes out. There's one right ahead of the hood release handle that does that. Then pull it down. Then part of this knee panel is the thinner black plastic part in the front. There are little portions of it that act as the end of the ducts into the floorboard. So you just pull that inward. This black plastic is very durable, so you don't really have to worry about breaking it. Pull that. Actually, push the e-brake down a little bit to make yourself a little more room here. Pull that. Pull the whole mess downward and outward. There. Then that just kind of slides out. Right. Now, there is a hole, there's an insulation. It's this kind of woven pressed insulation here. There is a hole in it where you can get your fingers up to both corners of the gauge, both lower corners of the gauge cluster, and then just alternate your pressure, pushing out. It can take quite a bit of pressure depending on just how the dash will have shrunk over the years a little bit, so it can. The point is, you're not going to hurt the cluster any more than it already has been. You're not going to do any undue damage by pushing out from behind fairly hard on it. And this dash cap that this car has on might be fighting me, but like I said, I'm not actually bothering the cluster because the main housing of the cluster isn't fragile. It's the face glued on to the housing of the cluster. That's the fragile part. And I'm slowly, there we go. There is a tool for this. It's usually not even necessary. And if you're not careful with it, you can put pressure on the lip of the lens of the cluster housing and actually do damage that you wouldn't have done otherwise. Dash cap on this one is causing a legitimate problem. But I can get my hand even further back in there to push more on the top. There we go. Yeah, sure enough, the lip of the dash cap, I think, was fighting me a little bit. But, as I said, no damage done. Sometimes the lens of the cluster would pop off, but honestly, sometimes they're just hanging on by a thread because of the original glue that was used. So sometimes you kind of haven't done any damage that could have been avoided anyway. But now I'll take my pen light, and if you can wedge the phone in there. Okay. Can you even see for the insulation anyway? You're also rarely going to hurt anything by pulling, because the speedometer cable is really stiff and it doesn't have a lot of slack in it. So you got to tug a bit to get the speedometer cable pulled out to where you can even get your hand back in there to undo the speedometer cable. But they're actually under that sheet of insulation. So I'm going to undo the speedometer cable. The speedometer cable is only held on by a knurled, like a thumb nut. You can almost always just get it popped loose with your hand. And then once the speedometer cable is undone, the cluster will actually come a lot further out very easily. Now you can see it. Let me get the light. That relay is the window relay. So I'll turn the key on here. Windows work. I'll pull the relay out. And Windows no worky. And of course, what's the part number? This is an original. Part number is 001-542-0219. I believe these are the same part number as is found right next to the master cylinder for the auxiliary fan and the AC compressor. They don't often fail, but the thing about these is that anytime the key is on, this relay is energized, it's in. So these see a lot of hours of any hours that are on the engine are literally on this relay. So it's pretty impressive that they even last as long as they do. But yeah, I think it's pretty much all there is to it. To put the gauge cluster back in, aside from connecting the speedometer cable, which it can be a challenge to get it pulled far enough out to get it back in the fitting on the back of the speedometer and get the nut aligned to where it will thread on. That's something that I even struggle with on some cars, depending on how limber the speedometer cable is. But aside from reconnecting the speedometer cable, assuming you didn't tug any of the little spade connectors loose on the back of the cluster, you just squarely and applying even force, push it back in. It just sits in there with this rubber gasket to kind of hold it in. And then the knee panel is also pretty much assembly is the reverse of removal. Hope this helps.